I did work in the archive in Odessa, and I looked at criminal reports compiled by policemen, police officials, as well as the judiciary. And of course, whatever journalistic accounts found their way into the newspapers. But with newspapers, you do have that added layer where everyone's playing up the myth in certain respects. Like they're engaged in myth making too. Now, what I would say though about Jewish gangsters though is that, and this is true of the United States as well, and I think it would be true of Jewish gangsters in the Ashkenazi world in general. Jews tended to be involved in white-collar crimes rather than in violent crimes. Now, of course, we all know about Meyer Lansky and these very famous Jewish gangsters who were part of Murder, Inc. But if you look demographically speaking, in terms of sheer numbers, the crimes that the Jews were involved in New York in the early 1900s, and this I believe is true for Odessa too, tended to be extortion rackets, which I don't mean to downplay the potential violence involved in extortion, but also in fraud. There's a lot of counterfeiting going on. Anything that involves international trade or even local trade with the bootlegging industry. Jews, and here's one where, of course, this is a really horrible industry. Jews played a very large role in the international prostitution trade. And this is something, yes, I would say at a certain generation, there were historians who would want to not talk about that, because it would lead to, they were scared of abetting anti-Semitism, so they'd be worried about it. But the international prostitution trade was a logical business for Jews to go into. They were multilingual. They were, by definition, a diasporic community who had connections in different countries, so it was very easy for them to set up these trading networks. They didn't have a problem with that. Being literate in multiple languages was to facilitate fraudulent travel documents for the very people to use. So there is a certain hush-hush about discussing that. And, but even in the newspapers in Odessa, it would come up. And the editors of these Russian-language newspapers were Jewish, so they certainly would have to worry about anti-Semitism. People would be downplaying things like that at certain points. But what's important to realize, too, I think, is also that the victims of these people in the prostitution trade were also Jewish, right? This wasn't, Jewish criminals who were trying to enslave non-Jewish women because they had some sort of Jewish agenda by any means whatsoever. The vast majority of the women who got sucked into this were Jewish as well. They were looking to get out of Russia, as millions of Jews were looking to get out of Russia. And sometimes they were getting duped into the international prostitution trade. They were promised a husband or a job or something in the New World, and they would find themselves either in New Orleans, but also in Constantinople or Buenos Aires, Rio, and various other destinations, and they would be, it's a familiar story. They'd be trapped in international prostitution. It'd be very hard to get out of it. So, yes, and if you want to stick with violence, just to go on with that, I can give you another example with the violence and how it's downplayed. And this is not necessarily being done because of fears of anti-Semitism. This would be the pogrom of 1905, which was the largest one to that point in the Imperial Russia. At least 400 were killed. I mean, the Kishinev pogrom of 1903 only resulted in 49 deaths. So the Odessa pogrom was huge. And during the Great Patriotic War, during World War II, there were serious massacres of Jews, especially unleashed by the Romanians. I mean, the Odessa massacre was massive. And the only reason I think Odessa's Jewish population was able to survive was because the Romanians were so utterly inefficient at committing genocide compared to the Germans. Germany didn't occupy Odessa until the end of the war, and by that point, most of the Jews had fled out of the city. Now, here's the interesting thing. Why aren't people talking about these things when they're talking about the myth of old Odessa? This doesn't sound like a good time, right? I mean, this clearly sounds like there's ethnic tension there and there's ethnic friction. During my job interview at Ohio, the professor there whose specialty is World War II and so he asked me outright about, where's World War II in all this? I remember presenting a paper once and someone said, where's the pogrom in all this? Well, the myth makers chose not to really focus on these things because they wanted to remember the city and celebrate the city for certain things. And this included, the ethnic harmony that existed there because they created this culture of criminality, which had place for Jews and Ukrainians and Russians and Greeks and all these other groups.